The rift was an anomaly no one expected and no one wanted. It shimmered like a jagged wound in the fabric of space, pulsating with violent energy that defied known physics. Ships that ventured too close vanished without a trace, their distress calls garbled echoes in the void. Probes sent to study it returned fractured data, images of impossible geometries and shadowy forms that flickered in and out of existence. It was beautiful and terrifying, a cosmic enigma that radiated danger. Humanity's first encounter with the rift was a disaster. A civilian transport ship, Aurora's Reach, strayed into its vicinity while testing a new hyperspace route. The crew's last transmission described an expanding surge of energy before their signal was abruptly cut. Hours later, Earth's sensors picked up the rift's first pulse, a massive shockwave that destabilized nearby systems, disrupting planetary orbits and turning a mining colony into a graveyard. The message was clear: the rift was not a passive anomaly. It was a gateway to something far worse. The Galactic community convened an emergency summit, broadcasting their debates across the stars. The Alliance of Savants, a coalition of the galaxy's most advanced species, argued fiercely. The Akirans, known for their vast fleets and cold pragmatism, proposed an immediate quarantine of the region. The Vrindari, ethereal beings attuned to the cosmos, urged caution, claiming the rift's energy signatures resonated with an ancient and forbidden pattern. The Oraskar, merchants and opportunists, suggested the rift could be exploited, though none of their representatives dared approach it. Humanity, relatively new to interstellar politics, remained silent as the larger empires argued. When the floor opened for proposals, Captain Elias Trenholm of the Terran Defense Corps stepped forward. He was not a politician, but his voice carried the weight of a soldier who had seen too much loss. Humanity would take responsibility for the rift, he declared. While others debated, they would act. The declaration was met with derision. The Akirans laughed openly, calling humanity reckless for presuming they could face such a threat. The Vrindari remained silent, their crystalline forms flickering with unease. Humanity, with its modest fleets and limited resources, was dismissed as an insignificant player in a game too dangerous for their kind. But humanity's resolve did not waver. Within weeks, construction began on the Bastion, a massive defensive platform engineered to withstand anything the rift could unleash. It was built in orbit above Enceladus, far enough from Earth to minimize collateral damage, but close enough to draw from the Terran Union's industrial might. Engineers worked tirelessly, their designs pushing the limits of human ingenuity. The Bastion was more than a station, it was a symbol of defiance. The galaxy watched with morbid curiosity as humanity poured its resources into what many believed was a futile effort. But for humans, it wasn't just about survival. The rift was a threat to all life, and if no one else would stand against it, then humanity would become the galaxy's shield. As the Bastion's reactors roared to life and its cannons aligned toward the rift, humanity sent a message to the stars. It was brief and simple: we guard the gates. The Bastion stood as a monument to humanity's audacity, its shadow stretching across the icy surface of Enceladus. Its outer shell bristled with weaponry, kinetic railguns, plasma lances, and missile silos capable of delivering devastation to any threat. Within its steel walls, thousands of soldiers, engineers, and scientists prepared for what they hoped would never come. Yet, deep down, everyone knew the rift would not remain dormant forever. The first attack came on the eve of the Bastion's final readiness tests. The station's sensors detected a sudden surge in the rift's energy signature, a pulse so intense it overwhelmed nearby probes. Without warning, the rift expanded, spilling out an ominous glow that turned the void an unnatural shade of crimson. Alarms blared across the Bastion as officers scrambled to interpret the data flooding their consoles. Then they appeared. The creatures emerged in swarms, silhouetted against the rift's unnatural light. At first glance, they seemed chaotic, a tangle of limbs, metallic appendages, and pulsating organic mass. But as they moved, a horrifying logic became apparent. These were not mindless beasts. They were purpose-built, engineered for destruction. They moved with precision, their forms shifting and adapting as they closed the distance to the bastion. The station's weapons roared to life. Railguns fired slugs at near-light speeds, shredding the vanguard of the swarm. Plasma lances carved arcs of searing energy through the void, vaporizing dozens of creatures in their path. Missiles streaked toward clusters of the entities, detonating in blinding flashes that briefly pushed back the tide. For a moment, the defenders believed they could hold the line, but the rift's horrors had only begun to reveal themselves. A larger entity emerged, dwarfing the others. It was a grotesque fusion of machine and flesh, its central body a warped sphere of churning metal and pulsating organs. Tendrils extended from its mass, each tipped with barbed appendages that emitted bursts of energy. It absorbed the bastion's firepower with ease, its outer shell regenerating faster than the station's weapons could damage it. The bastion's commander, Admiral Sarah Volkov, made a snap decision. She ordered the activation of the station's experimental arc cannon, a weapon designed as a last resort. The cannon required a full minute to charge, its power draw dimming lights across the bastion. Meanwhile, the swarm pressed closer, their smaller units targeting the station's weak points. The arc cannon fired, unleashing a beam of pure energy that tore through the massive entity and cleaved the swarm in two. The battlefield went silent for a moment as the remaining creatures scattered, but the cost of victory was steep. Half the bastion's defensive grid had been destroyed, and nearly a third of its crew were dead or injured. The victory was Pyrrhic, a stark reminder that this was only the beginning. Humanity had survived its first encounter with the rift, but the galaxy would soon learn the horrifying truth. The entities were not mindless. They were probing, testing, learning, and they would return. The bastion floated in the void, scared but operational. Humanity had survived the first incursion, but the victory was bitter. Repairs were underway, yet morale wavered. The rift's attack had revealed its terrifying intelligence, and the defenders knew it was only a matter of time before the next wave came, likely stronger and deadlier. Far from the bastion, on the shining capital world of the Alliance of Salphons, the response to humanity's broadcasted triumph was far from celebratory. The Akirans, who prided themselves on their fleet superiority, whispered among themselves that humanity's defiance was reckless bravado. The Oraskar saw opportunity in the chaos, spreading rumors that humanity had provoked the rift's aggression by tampering with forces beyond their comprehension. The Vrindari, enigmatic as ever, voiced cryptic warnings that the rift's awakening was no mere coincidence, and that humanity's insistence on standing against it would doom the galaxy. In private chambers, a shadowy coalition formed, composed of alien factions who view humanity's rise as a destabilizing force. They saw the bastion not as a line of defense, but as a growing threat. These species believed that humanity's continued defiance would provoke the rift entities into catastrophic retaliation. If the bastion fell, they reasoned, the rift might turn dormant again, sparing the galaxy further destruction. The plan was ruthless and simple: sabotage. Back on the bastion, the atmosphere remained tense but resolute. Admiral Volkov stood before her officers in the dimly lit command chamber. Repairs to the station's defensive systems were nearly complete, and the next phase of operations was to deploy advanced drones to monitor the rift more closely. The team knew their actions were watched by the rest of the galaxy with suspicion, but humanity's oath to protect the stars from the rift remained unbroken. The saboteurs struck in the dead of night cycle. Disguised as refugees from a Vrindari colony that had suffered during the rift's initial pulse, they had been allowed aboard under strict surveillance. They moved with precision, planting devices in the Bastion's energy distribution cores. When activated, the devices would disrupt power across the station, leaving critical systems vulnerable. The betrayal coincided with a second rift surge. The station's sensors screamed as another swarm emerged, larger, faster, and more coordinated than the first. As weapons officers scrambled to bring the Bastion's arsenal online, the saboteurs triggered their devices. The lights dimmed, shields faltered, and entire sections of the station went dark. Panic erupted as the swarm descended. The Bastion's defenders fought valiantly, improvising as power flickered across the station. Engineers worked feverishly to bypass the damage, and Admiral Volkov coordinated the resistance with calm precision. In the end, the saboteurs were discovered and neutralized, but not before their actions cost hundreds of lives and critical infrastructure. Humanity prevailed once more, but the cost was undeniable. The Bastion had been weakened, and the Rift entities had learned. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as humanity revealed the betrayal, transmitting footage of the sabotage to every corner of known space. Trust was shattered, and humanity declared it would never again rely on the goodwill of others. They would stand alone, stronger than ever. The Rift, watching and waiting, pulsed faintly in approval. The Bastion drifted in solemn resilience, its surface scared from countless repairs, its defenders hardened by betrayal and loss. For months, the Rift remained eerily quiet, its pulsating light a constant reminder of the unknown horrors it concealed. Humanity worked tirelessly to fortify the Bastion, using every ounce of ingenuity to upgrade its systems. Despite the calm, no one dared to believe the Rift had relented. And then the whispers began. It started with the crew in the outer wings of the Bastion. They reported hearing faint voices over their communication systems, soft murmurs that seemed to echo their thoughts or fears. Engineers chalked it up to residual interference from the Rift's energy surges, but the phenomena grew worse. Soldiers started seeing fleeting shadows in the corridors, shapes that disappeared the moment they turned to face them. Sleep became elusive as nightmares gripped the crew, vivid dreams of falling into the Rift and being consumed by endless, cold void. The Bastion's command team convened in secret, poring over logs and sensor readings. Admiral Volkov listened in grim silence as her officers described anomalies that defied explanation. Energy signatures were appearing and disappearing in sections of the Bastion that should have been secure. Atmospheric fluctuations mimicked breathing. Deep space scans detected patterns within the Rift's pulsations, patterns that resembled brainwave activity. Something was waking. Humanity's scientific community worked around the clock, analyzing the data. A breakthrough came when Dr. Alina Kor, a xenophysicist stationed on the Bastion, discovered a hidden signal embedded in the Rift's energy waves. It was a transmission, an alien code repeating endlessly, but growing more complex with each cycle. Dr. Kor theorized the Rift wasn't just a gateway, it was a prison, and its prisoner, the entity humanity would come to know as the Harbinger, was beginning to stir. As the Bastion's leaders debated the implications, the Rift responded with unprecedented violence. A shockwave radiated outward, engulfing nearby systems and plunging them into chaos. Planets suffered power outages, starships lost control, and entire colonies reported hallucinations of dark, looming figures. The Bastion itself was struck by the wave, though its reinforced systems held. The crew braced for another attack, but instead, emissaries emerged. They were grotesque and otherworldly, a blend of organic tissue and sleek alien machinery. The emissaries hovered just beyond the Bastion's weapons range, radiating a palpable aura of dread. They made no overtly hostile moves, yet their presence was a message in itself. Humanity quickly learned the emissaries were projecting psychic signals, influencing the minds of anyone who came too close. Dr. Kor and her team managed to decode fragments of the transmissions. The Harbinger spoke through its emissaries, offering a choice: surrender and join its will, or face annihilation. It promised oblivion for resistance and eternity for compliance. Admiral Volkov delivered humanity's response in the only language she trusted the Harbinger would understand. She ordered the Bastion's weapons to fire. The emissaries were obliterated, their remains dissolving into the void. The Harbinger had awakened fully, and its wrath was coming. Humanity, isolated and defiant, prepared for a war unlike anything the galaxy had ever known. The destruction of the emissaries sent a clear signal: humanity would not bow. But the Harbinger's response was swift and merciless. The rift erupted in a surge of energy, unleashing a torrent of horrors unlike anything seen before. Swarms of entities, larger and more advanced than the previous waves, emerged in coordinated formations. Each was a deadly fusion of organic and synthetic matter, capable of adapting to humanity's weapons and tactics in real time. The Bastion sounded its alarms as the entities closed in. Cannons roared, missiles streaked through the void, and plasma lances cut arcs of brilliance across the blackness of space. The defenders fought valiantly, but these entities were smarter, faster, and more relentless. For every one destroyed, two more took its place. As if the physical assault wasn't enough, the Harbinger deployed a subtler, deadlier weapon: psychic warfare. Members of the Bastion's crew began turning on each other, their minds overwhelmed by invasive thoughts. Soldiers collapsed, screaming of unseen horrors. Others sabotaged critical systems before being subdued. The Bastion's artificial intelligence, Helena, strained to counter the Harbinger's intrusion, her systems fighting to filter the psychic signals flooding the station. In the midst of the chaos, betrayal struck again. Several galactic factions, lured by the Harbinger's promise of power and survival, launched surprise attacks on the Bastion. Allied fleets, once claiming neutrality, now bore down on humanity's lone fortress. Their ships opened fire, targeting weakened sections of the station and cutting off supply routes. Admiral Volkov stood unyielding in the command center, directing the defense with precision born of desperation. Humanity would not fall, not to the Harbinger, and not to traitors. She ordered the remaining fleet to focus fire on the attacking factions, driving them back long enough to re-establish control of the Bastion. But even as they succeeded, the cost was staggering. Amid the chaos, the Harbinger's forces executed their most devastating move. Infiltrator entities, disguised as remnants of destroyed swarms, latched onto the Bastion's hull. These warforms began tearing into the station's infrastructure, breaching its interior. Once inside, they unleashed devastation in the corridors, slaughtering crew and disabling vital systems. It was Helena, the Bastion's AA, who made the ultimate sacrifice. To counter the infiltrators, she initiated a full system purge, locking down entire sections of the station and flooding them with high-energy plasma. The strategy succeeded in eradicating the warforms, but it came at the cost of Helena herself. Her voice, once calm and reassuring, faded as she directed her final energy reserves towards saving the station. With the infiltrators destroyed and the traitorous fleets retreating, the Bastion endured once more. But the damage was profound. Helena was gone, the station's defenses were critically weakened, and nearly a quarter of the crew had been lost. The Harbinger had made its intentions clear. The rift was no longer a passive threat. It was a force of annihilation, and it would stop at nothing to consume the galaxy. Humanity, battered but unbroken, prepared to face the darkness with a ferocity born of defiance. The Bastion hovered in a fragile state of recovery, its once proud form now marred by scars of endless battle. The loss of Helena weighed heavily on the crew, her absence a silence that felt more oppressive than the screams of war. Yet even in their grief, humanity's defiance burned brighter. The Harbinger's attacks, relentless and overwhelming, had proven one thing: the rift was not invincible. Dr. Alina Kaur stood in the Bastion's war room, surrounded by the grim faces of the remaining command staff. On the table before them, a holographic projection of the rift shimmered ominously. Weeks of analysis had yielded a dangerous discovery. The energy patterns within the rift weren't random. They were converging toward a single point deep within its heart. Dr. Core believed this nexus was the Harbinger's core, its anchor to the material universe. Destroying it could sever the entity's connection to the galaxy, but reaching it was a suicide mission. Admiral Volkov made the decision without hesitation. Humanity had nothing left to lose. They would take the fight to the enemy, plunging into the very heart of the rift to end the Harbinger's reign of terror. The mission, dubbed Operation Black Veil, began with a desperate race against time. Engineers worked tirelessly to retrofit a fleet of warships with experimental shielding to withstand the rift's chaotic energies. Scientists developed countermeasures to block the Harbinger's psychic assaults, implanting neural dampeners into the brains of the mission's volunteers. Every ounce of human ingenuity was poured into the operation, knowing failure meant extinction. The fleet departed the bastion under the watchful eyes of the remaining crew. Cheers and salutes echoed through the corridors, but behind them was an unspoken truth: few, if any, would return. As the ships entered the rift, reality itself seemed to warp around them. The swirling vortex of crimson and black stretched endlessly, its chaotic patterns defying logic. Time slowed and fractured, with some crew members experiencing hours of silence, while others felt mere seconds pass. The ship's shields flared against waves of energy, each surge threatening to tear them apart. Inside the rift, the Harbinger revealed its true form. Vast and incomprehensible, it manifested as a shifting amalgamation of stars, machinery, and organic tendrils. It loomed above the fleet, its presence pressing down like the weight of a collapsing sun. Fragments of its voice pierced through the neural dampeners, filling minds with promises of salvation and visions of despair. The fleet pressed forward, fighting through swarms of entities defending the Harbinger's core. Ships were lost in fiery explosions, their crews' final cries lost to the void. Yet humanity's resolve never wavered. At last, they reached the Nexus, a colossal, pulsating sphere radiating energy that bent space around it. Admiral Volkov, aboard the flagship Indomitable, gave the final order. The fleet unleashed everything they had, a relentless barrage of missiles, beams, and detonations converging on the core. The Harbinger screamed. The rift trembled, its energies spiraling into chaos. Victory seemed within reach, but something far worse was awakening. The Harbinger's scream reverberated through the rift, a soundless howl that pressed against every human mind. Neural dampeners strained under the psychic assault, some failing entirely as crew members collapsed in agony. For those who endured, it was clear the Harbinger was not dying, it was transforming. The Nexus, once a pulsating sphere of energy, began to fracture. Chunks of its outer shell floated into the void, revealing an inner mass of shifting geometries and incomprehensible light. The fleet's sensors struggled to process what they were seeing. The Harbinger's core wasn't merely a source of power, it was a gateway, a breach into a deeper realm of chaos. Admiral Volkov barked orders to the fleet, demanding a renewed assault on the exposed core. Humanity's ships surged forward, their weapons roaring in defiance. Explosions blossomed across the Nexus, but for every strike that landed, tendrils of energy lashed out in retaliation. Ships were torn apart, their remains dragged into the ever-expanding gateway. Dr. Core, monitoring from the Indomitable, delivered grim news. The Harbinger wasn't just resisting, it was growing. The destruction of the Nexus had destabilized the rift, merging its energies with the entity. What had been a contained threat was now spilling into the galaxy, an unchecked cascade of annihilation. In a desperate gamble, Volkov ordered the fleet to activate the Omega device, a weapon of last resort. The Omega device was a miniature singularity generator, designed to collapse a star. If deployed at the heart of the nexus, it could sever the Harbinger's connection to the rift entirely, but it came with a devastating cost. The fleet would not have enough time to escape the blast radius. The crew of the Indomitable volunteered for the mission without hesitation. The weapon was armed and loaded into the flagship's payload bay, its containment field humming with lethal energy. As the rest of the fleet provided covering fire, the Indomitable charged toward the nexus. The Harbinger responded with fury. Its tendrils coalesced into massive constructs, each one dwarfing the flagship. They lashed out, battering the Indomitable's shields and tearing into its hull. Fires raged across the ship's decks, and casualties mounted with every second. Yet the crew pressed on, driven by the knowledge that humanity's survival depended on their success. Within the chaos, the Harbinger reached out once more, its psychic tendrils piercing into the minds of the remaining crew. It showed them visions of Earth consumed, its cities twisted into unrecognizable forms. It whispered of inevitability, that resistance was futile against its eternal will. Admiral Volkov, battered and bleeding, activated the Omega device's final sequence. She stared into the Harbinger's form, her resolve unshaken. Humanity had defied it not out of arrogance, but because they refused to yield. With a final burst of energy, the Indomitable breached the nexus. The Omega device detonated, unleashing a singularity that began to consume the Harbinger's core and the surrounding rift. The remaining ships of the fleet, battered and broken, turned to flee, but most would not escape. The rift began to collapse, and with it, the stars themselves seemed to weep. The aftermath of the Omega device's detonation was nothing short of cataclysmic. The singularity began its hungry collapse, devouring the Harbinger's core and everything around it. The rift itself, once a vast and foreboding presence in the galaxy, writhed in agony, its energies destabilizing in a chaotic spiral. Space itself seemed to fracture, stretching and bending in ways that defied all known laws of physics. Time lost its meaning. The remaining ships of humanity's fleet barely managed to escape the singularity's gravitational pull. The Indomitable, the last of the human warships still intact, slowed as the massive rip in spacetime loomed behind them. The crew, exhausted and broken, had given everything. But as they looked back at the fading light of the rift, it was clear the cost had been far greater than anyone had imagined. On board, Admiral Volkov stood alone in the observation deck, her face a mask of solemnity. The stars ahead were distant, cold, and uncaring. She gazed out at the swirling chaos in the distance, the remnants of the rift now collapsing in on itself, taking the Harbinger with it. But it was a hollow victory. Humanity had lost too much, too many lives, too many ships. As the Indomitable limped away, the transmission crackled. The voices of the survivors, those who had endured the Harbinger's final onslaught, echoed across the comm channels. The fleet was gone. There would be no reinforcements, no help. The galaxy was now a silent witness to the destruction of one of its greatest threats. But the survivors knew that the rift was not the only darkness lurking in the void. Dr. Kaur, who had barely survived the assault, began compiling the last of her data. She looked at the readings coming from the collapsing rift. "It's over," she whispered, almost to herself. But the rift, it was just the beginning. Her hands trembled as she continued her analysis. The Omega device had done its job, but the cosmic rift left in its wake might allow other, far darker entities to slip through. The war had ended, but the war wasn't the end. Back in the command center, Admiral Volkov addressed her crew, standing before a shattered holographic map of the galaxy. Her voice was steady but grave. "We've done it. We've stopped the Harbinger. But our fight isn't over. We've seen what the rift was, and we've seen what it could become. The galaxy is full of mysteries far darker than we ever imagined. We will rebuild, we will fight, and we will never forget what we've lost." With that, humanity's final stand against the rift concluded. The survivors turned their eyes to the stars, knowing that their place in the galaxy had changed forever. The galaxy would remember the day humanity stood against the unknown, pushed back against the darkness, and emerged victorious, if only for a time. As the Indomitable drifted into the blackness, alone and fading, the last remnants of the Bastion survivors vowed to rebuild their fallen home. But the rift, even in its collapse, had shown them a harsh truth. Humanity's place at the gates of the galaxy was not just as protectors, but as the last line of defense against an eternal night. And in the distance, beyond the dying rift, something stirred, a new threat, a new darkness waiting to be unleashed. Humanity, forever vigilant, would stand ready, guardians of the galaxy, the eternal sentinels.